I wanted to get started, and I wanted to just give a little context. Pretty uniquely, earlier this year, both the House Speaker and the Senate President said in various meetings before different business groups, we want to hear from the business community about your ideas to help fix and fund transportation. And that was a unique opportunity that I think was really important for all of us to pay attention to. So there's been two business groups that have been meeting regularly, looking at the problem and the solutions and the options. And those groups are about to present ideas to the House and Senate leadership very soon, sometime later this month, that are really outlining some of the ideas we're going to hear today. So today is an opportunity for us as a chamber, including a lot of our elected officials, and I'm really grateful to all the city councilors, selectmen, and candidates who are here with us this morning, to hear about those ideas from really two people, hopefully two people, we'll get Kathryn here, who really are subject matter experts on this. So Chris Dempsey from Transportation for Massachusetts, and Kathryn Carlson from A Better City, and I'll let them both explain what they do and where they come from. I wanted to know Jessie Ramel, candidate for Congress, is here with us this morning. We're delighted to have her, and in particular, Jessie led one of those two groups that was really busy and active involved in this, and I'm grateful for your leadership on that, and to have you here today, and to have all of you here today. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris, and when Kathryn gets here, she can jump in too. Thanks.
Good morning, everybody. How's everybody doing? Good. Thank you to Greg and everybody for having me here today. I'm Chris Dempsey. I'm the Director of Transportation for Massachusetts. And Kathryn, who will be here soon, is a friend and colleague of mine. She works at A Better City, which is a business association focused on really issues within 128. Transportation for Massachusetts is a statewide advocacy coalition. So you see some of our members on the board here. An example of that would be MassBike, and we have Tom from MassBike here who lives nearby, and then the Alliance for Business Leadership organization that Jessie just stepped down from running. Let's talk about the problem with transportation. So a few years ago, U.S. News and World Report started ranking states. For years they ranked universities and they ranked hospitals, and they started ranking states. They ranked Massachusetts as the #1 state in the entire country. We were #1 in education, we were #2 in healthcare, and we were #45 in transportation. So we have the best educated and healthiest workforce in the country, and maybe on the entire planet. And then we force that workforce to deal with situations like this one, the derailment on the Red Line. And MBTA has the second most derailments of any transit system in the country over the last 5 years. Of course, not just transit is the problem. We've also got the problem of emissions and air pollution, and the climate implications of that, and the public health implications of that. Transportation is now by far the largest source of air pollution in Massachusetts. It's not even close. The way to think about that is there's much more pollution coming out of our tailpipes than coming out of our power plants. And of course, we have the issue of congestion. And in fact, earlier this year, which is a national traffic data firm, ranked Greater Boston as the most congested region in the entire country. More congested than Los Angeles, or New York, or San Francisco, or Chicago, or Miami. We have the worst traffic in the country. So it's really important that we start to take action at the state level to address these problems. And here's sort of where we are on the timeline today. As Greg mentioned, in March, the Speaker of the House, Bob DeLeo, went to the business community and to the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce, but really speaking to the broader business community, and said, we're looking for ideas and solutions. We need your help coming up with answers to these really pressing problems. So that was in March. The end of the legislative session, the end of the time at which the legislature can take a vote on transportation, is July 31st, 2020. The halfway mark, that little hash mark in the middle, is November 8th, and we're at the start. So we're already almost halfway through this process, But it's definitely a backloaded process. There's a lot of work for us to do in the next 5 or 6 months. And we're at this moment where groups like the Newton-Needham Chamber can really make a statement to the legislature and to the broader public about what your priorities are and what you want to see done to fix these transportation problems that are impacting your businesses and your customers and your stakeholders, as well as the broader state. So we need to start with a question and conversation around reform and governance changes. And there's a lot to do here. Everything from looking at procurement at the MBTA and MassDOT, how do we update that to make it more efficient, to looking at the MBTA's governance and accountability structure. In 2015, the governor created the FMCB, the Fiscal and Management Control Board. That board has done a great job, and I was a skeptic of that board when it was put in place, but they've really gone above and beyond expectations and shined a light on some of the problems at the MBTA. But their authorizing legislation expires in the middle of 2020. In fact, that same date of midsummer 2020. So we need the legislature to take some action on that. And then, of course, there's a broader revenue question, too. And I don't necessarily want to define our transportation problems as a revenue problem because there's other issues associated with them, things like congestion and air pollution. But money is going to be really important. And the order of magnitude here is somewhere in the $30 billion range over a time period of between now and 2040, call it 20 years. Additional revenue that is needed to be put into the system to make it work better. And as we think about revenue, I think it's really important to consider the different types of revenue that might be available to help address some of these problems. And there's kind of two ways to think about funding transportation. One is to say, let's use user fees. Let's use revenue that is derived from the users of the system. That's things like a gas tax or tolling or parking fees or MBTA fares, things that are associated with how you're using the system. One reason that transportation nerds like me like user fees is because they do a couple things. One is that they're actually constitutionally protected in many cases. So the Massachusetts Constitution actually says that the gas tax has to go to transportation funding. It can't be used for other things. And the second is that you start to get a little bit of behavior change. And we'll talk a little bit about why that's important to help fix some of these problems in the system. Now, there are alternatives to user fees. And these are the things that the legislature will look to if the case is not made on user fees, if we don't make the case on the gas tax or tolling. Those are things like sales taxes, corporate taxes, real estate transfer taxes, other things that they could do this session to help inject some dollars into transportation. I hope we have a conversation in the Q&A about some of the pros and cons of this strategy versus user fees. But here's a sense of kind of where we are on the user fee picture. You can see where MBTA fares are compared to the gas tax. So since 1991, we have raised the gas tax by a total of 3 cents. That's 15%. In that same period of time, the average MBTA fare has gone up something like 200 to 300%. 15% versus 200 to 300%. And then we scratch our heads and we say, why do we have the worst congestion in the country? And we say, oh, it's because the pilgrims had crooked streets and cow paths. That's the reason why. That is not the reason why. The reason why is that 3 decades of public policy have sent an economic message to people that they should drive more and they should take transit less. We need to address that problem probably in both ways, both on the fare side, but then also on the cost of driving. And by the way, if you think housing prices in Massachusetts are high and have gone up substantially in the last 30 years, they've only gone up about half as much as MBTA fares have since 1991. And there are other important questions about the fairness and equity of our system today. So here's a map of the MBTA commuter rail system. And what would you think of a model for the commuter rail system where we decided to charge for some of the lines So let's say we charged for the Worcester line and we charged for the Fitchburg line and the Lakeville line, but the Needham Heights line was free, the Forge Park line was free, the Rockport line was free. Would that make any sense to anybody? Why you would charge for some and not for others? It doesn't make sense, right? But that's exactly the way that we charge our highways today. And folks in this community know that better than most. We have some facilities like the Mass Pike, the Tobin Bridge, the Sumner and Callahan Tunnel, the Ted Williams, where you pay, and other roads, some of which were just as expensive to build, like the Tip O'Neill Tunnel, where you don't pay a dime to drive through that. And the reality of the Pike, then, again, probably many of you know this, the only reason that we charge on the Pike and not on other roads is that the Pike was built before the Interstate Highway Act of 1956. Most of the highways built in the U.S. after 1956 were funded through the gas tax, or at least that's the idea, was to fund it through the gas tax and not charge a toll. The Pike was built before that, and so it has a toll. It's not a logical system. It's not one where if you were designing it from scratch today, you would come up with a system that you see here. So as we think about what are the sources of revenue here and the ways to better balance this system, it's going to require a mix of different things. Even if we're just focused on user fees, there's different options and ideas here, and we're going to dig into a couple of them in more detail. Here's a sense of what some of these fees or options could raise in terms of revenue. The gas tax, again, not a popular tax for the legislature to raise, but every penny of the gas tax raises $30 million in revenue. To give you a sense of scale there, the last MBTA fare increase was about $30 million. So we could have avoided the entire MBTA fare increase this summer by charging one more penny on the gas tax. Roadway pricing, which is really tolling in some way, can raise somewhere between $12 and $25 billion, and we'll get into more detail about what that would look like. And then you have things like R&B fees, which have not gone up on a regular basis, haven't gone up in the last 5 years, and small increases there actually give you pretty large leverage in terms of what you can raise. There's other ideas like T&C fees. So today, when you take an Uber or Lyft anywhere in Massachusetts, you pay a 20-cent fee for that ride. That was put in place when Uber and Lyft were much smaller. They weren't really on the consciousness of even every legislator at that time, 3 or 4 years ago. We're now in a world where there are 80 million T&C rides in Massachusetts every single year. 80 million Uber and Lyft trips. 40 million of those alone originate in the city of Boston. That means that every second of every day of the entire year, someone is calling an Uber or Lyft in the city of Boston. Other things like commercial parking surcharges, which we think make a lot of sense. Or things like there's a small tax change on the trade-ins of automobiles, where you sort of get a break from the state when you do that. And if we charged the full price that we charge on most goods, we could raise something like $100 million a year on that. So it's going to require a mix. And this is a slide from A Better City about how they think about the breakdown of where funding could come from, given kind of the numbers that they've come up with that are reasonable for these increases. So I want to dig in on 2 ideas that I think are really important and that are real moving ahead in the months to come. The first is something called the Transportation and Climate Initiative. In fact, just this week, Governor Baker announced that he is moving ahead with this program and has actually released the design of what this would look like. I'll go back to this slide. So the Transportation and Climate Initiative, or TCI, is an agreement across states of the Northeast, from Virginia actually all the way up to Maine. You can see in this image that Maine, New Hampshire, and New York are not included. They have not signed on to commit to be part of the program at this point, but they are part of the negotiations. And when you include those 3 states, plus the ones you see in green here, it's something like 25% of the entire United States economy is covered or is within this jurisdiction. And about a decade ago, many of these states came together and they created something called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. It's a cap and invest or cap and trade system for emissions from power plants. And effectively what it's done is it's actually brought down the kilowatt cost of energy. It's generated funds for investment into energy efficiency. And I said about 10 years ago, we put this in place. The last 9 years, Massachusetts has been named the most energy efficient economy in the entire state, the entire country. So that's not a coincidence that we put this program in place and then created funds for efficiency. And emissions have come down dramatically since we put this program in place on the electricity generation side. TCI is an attempt to take that same really successful market-based model and apply it to transportation. And I think it's because it's been proven to be successful on the energy side and because it has an important market mechanism to it that Governor Baker is really been a leader on this. In fact, he's been calling the other governors in the other states and saying, we want to make sure that you are still on board with this program. It's really important to Massachusetts. So the rough way that this would work is just like we require the emitters, the polluters on the power plant side to purchase permits equivalent to their emission under this environmental cap, we would require the importers of transportation fuels in Massachusetts and these other states to do the same thing. So think about it this way. There's no oil refineries anywhere in Massachusetts, right? That means 100% of the fuel that's purchased in Massachusetts crosses a state line. And there are wholesale fuel importing companies that do that business. We would require them to purchase a permit equivalent to the emissions that are created from that transportation fuel when it is burned by the end user. Those allowances, those permits are made available on a marketplace in an auction. So they bid on those and that sets the price. That's the market component of it. Now, depending on where the cap is set and how the price works, that program will generate probably somewhere between $150 million and $450 million per year, annual basis. And that number could grow higher over time. And that creates a pool of funds that, just like on the energy side, we took that pool of funds and we invested in making our electricity grid and our consumers more efficient. We want to do the same thing on transportation. So one would be to improve the resiliency to climate and weather changes of our road and bridge system. Make sure that they're addressing issues of flooding and sea level rise. The second is major investments in public transit, walking, and biking. The governor has already said that he wants to spend up to 50% of the revenue generated from this program on transit across the state, mostly the MBTA, but also the regional transit authorities. And then the third thing is to make our cars more efficient. So probably many of you have heard of the Mass Save program, which you can use to upgrade your light bulbs or put better insulation in your house. Really successful, well-known program that, again, has helped make us this energy efficient state. We want to create a mass save for vehicles. So just like when you go to buy a water heater, you get a discount for getting a more efficient one. We want you to, next time you go buy a car, to get a discount for getting an electric vehicle or a more fuel efficient vehicle. And you can use the funds generated from this program to do that. Let's talk about our roads and talk about this congestion issue. Again, the worst congestion in the country. Now, the old way of doing business for MassDOT is essentially to say, we're going to try to maybe add highway lanes. Maybe that will help with our congestion problem. And that's proven time and time again to be counterproductive. It just brings more cars onto the road and creates more bottlenecks in other places. Another strategy has been to say, well, let's create transit lines that are parallel to those roads. And that can work for a little bit. That can pull some cars off the road. But then they come right back on. Because that space opens up, other cars come right back on the highway. And Kathryn has just joined us.
Everything is so wrong on a radio meeting in the morning with Rob. Kathryn's me this morning, so I apologize for.
So this is the old way of doing business. Essentially, what MassDOT has done is say we're going to try to build our way out of this problem. And the reality is that MassDOT is actually pretty good at repairing our roads and bridges. Think about the Ave Bridge replacement project over the Pike. They did a pretty good job with that, right? The disruption was less than people were expecting. They got it done pretty quickly. But the problem is that the second they did the ribbon cutting on that bridge, all of the congestion on Commonwealth Ave came right back, right? It didn't actually help the long-term problem other than to repair the bridge. doing business that highway departments around the country are adopting, and that MassDOT needs to adopt too, is to manage that road actively. To say our job is not just to reconstruct the bridges and pave the roads, it's to make sure that traffic is flowing, to make sure that that road is working well for the users of that road that need it to work. So here's an example of that will be very familiar to you. This is real data with volumes and with speeds from the Newtonville eastbound gantry. So the blue bars are the volumes. You can see it pick up in the morning peak, and just as that happens, the speeds on the turnpike start to drop. You see the same thing happening in the afternoon peak. Again, this is not anything new to people in this room. You're familiar with the fact that congestion is really bad on the pike, especially in these sort of rush hour periods. And what's happening here is what economists and traffic engineers call a non-linear function. Essentially, traffic can flow freely up to the point of the designed highway capacity of that road. And then once you get to that capacity point, every car that gets added to the system creates more congestion than the car that came before it. That's the non-linear piece. So it kind of looks like a hockey stick, right? That's a really bad dynamic for society as a whole. It's how we go from a free-flowing road to gridlock pretty quickly. There's one small silver lining to this really unfortunate dynamic, which is that when things are really bad and congested at rush hour, taking a relatively small number of cars off the road can have a relatively big impact. So the rough rule of thumb here is that at rush hour, if you can get 5% of cars off the road, you get a 20% reduction in traffic congestion. And so if we want to reduce traffic in Greater Boston by 20%, we don't need everybody to get off the roads. We just need like 1 in 20 people to be encouraged to carpool or to take a train or to shift the time of their trip or not to take their trip at all. Just 1 in 20. That's a doable target. All over the world that are already using incentives to do that. This is a photograph that I took from the back seat of a taxi cab in Buenos Aires, Argentina. They're still using cash to pay for their tolls on this road, but they have figured out that it makes sense to charge different prices, whether you're driving at rush hour, which is the hora pico, 63 pesos, or whether you're driving outside of rush hour, the hora no pico, 45 pesos. They've been doing this for decades in places like Argentina. And here's some examples from Washington, D.C. and Seattle, real competitor regions of Greater Boston. In Buenos Aires, they just have a flat peak and off-peak. On these roads, the price actually moves up and down depending on the real-time traffic congestion on that road. So it floats, and what it does is it floats in a way that tries to ensure that cars can travel at 60 miles per hour or more. It manages that demand in real time. And this might sound kind of like futuristic to you, like this really weird idea that's never happened in New England, which is true. When we look at the top 10 largest metropolitan regions in the country, Greater Boston is the only one that does not do some sort of time of day pricing on its toll roads. The only one that does not. Think about driving over the George Washington Bridge in New York. For years, they've had a peak and an off-peak price. And now they're moving to a more sophisticated version of congestion pricing, where they're going to have tolls anywhere in Lower Manhattan. Competitor regions like Seattle and Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles, for over a decade now, have had these roads where the price varies depending on the time of day. And we have the technology to do this. As you all know, we took down our toll booths a few years ago, 2017, we took them down. We had them from 1934 until 2017. I remember these tickets when I did car trips with my parents to Western Mass. Now you just pay with the gantry. MassDOT has the technology to do this in a matter of weeks or months. This is not a difficult technology problem. And there is no question that congestion pricing, using pricing as a tool to reduce demand, works. There is no question that it works. You have quotes here from the Federal Highway Administration, from the Seattle Department of Transportation, Los Angeles Times, the Partnership for New York City, which is one of the larger Chamber of Commerce groups in New York. They all have concluded that this is in fact, not just the thing that works, the best way to reduce and manage congestion. And again, we're the only one of the top 10 largest regions in the country that does not do this. It's not a coincidence that we have the worst traffic. Now, maybe I've convinced you, maybe not, but maybe I've convinced you that this technique works to reduce congestion. But probably a lot of you are thinking, well, maybe it works, but is this fair? Is it fair to have a system where people are paying more at some times than others? Is it fair to have a system where maybe people start to say, well, I can't afford to drive on that road anymore, and I'm losing my option for how I get to work? Kathryn's going to dig in detail on this question, but I want to offer just one example that I think is really relevant here, which is the 111 bus. It's the third busiest bus in the MBTA system. It starts in Revere. It picks up most of its passengers in downtown Chelsea. It goes over the Tobin Bridge and drops people off at Haymarket. So these are blue-collar workers. Most of them are getting paid by the hour. They're working in restaurants. They're cleaning offices in downtown Boston. And the MBTA is actually providing relatively good service on that line because there's so much demand for it. In fact, at rush hour, those buses leave every 4 minutes. That's how much demand there is for this bus line. And these buses are packed every 4 minutes. The problem is that to go from downtown Chelsea to downtown Boston will regularly take 45 minutes to go 2.7 miles. That's an average speed of less than 4 miles an hour. You could walk, I heard someone say it, you could walk faster. You could walk faster, you could definitely bike faster.
They let you walk over the Tobin Bridge.
But when we built the Tobin Bridge in the 1950s, we made it illegal to walk or bike over the Tobin Bridge. And so we forced these workers to be packed in like sardines while they're late, and they only get paid when they are physically at the job. Compare that to the other folks in this photo who maybe are coming from the wealthier suburbs to the north, are driving their SUV, are a partner at a law firm, or the owner of a dental practice, and they get paid because they can do a conference call on the road. They get paid whether they're there or not. They're a salaried employee, or they're maybe even higher, an executive. And I want to ask whether that status quo is fair. Whether the system we have today is one that works well for these 12,000 riders a day that are taking the 111 bus. As a point of reference here, you could take 2 111 buses. You see one in the picture. You could take one more 111 bus, and there would be as many people in those 2 buses as in every other car in this photograph. So is that status quo fair? Let me turn it over to Kathryn.
Chris, can I just point out too that when we talk to folks like the hotels along the Bay Area, their employees are riding that bus and then taking the green line or taking the red line and the green line or whatever. These are folks that are actually working in our market in many cases who live in those communities.
So they're really, jumping on the green line at Haymarket.
Right, and then they get to Riverside and then they still have to figure out how to get to the hotel.
So 45 minutes just for the first leg of their trip. And then they get on the green line and do another 45 minutes. Is that status quo fair?
Hello, guys. I guess Chris ran through my initial slide, so thank you. I've got deep apologies. I'm learning how long it can take to get to you at 7:30 in the morning. But to Chris's point, I know he went over this earlier, but why a lot of...
You want to just tell people who you are?
Oh, yeah, of course. I'm sorry. I'm Kathryn Carlson. I work for an organization called A Better City. And again, Chris probably did a little intro of what our organizations do. Our group is a business association of about 130 large employers in the Boston area that focus on transportation, infrastructure, land use, and environmental policy. So we formed out of the Big Dig and the need for a civic organization to help ensure that project reached fruition, which we're all happy when we walk over the Rose Kennedy Greenway now that did. But we, since that time, have gained quite an expertise in working on transportation and land use policy. So that's what I do. From a business perspective, which is why, as Chris probably ran through those slides, why we're so focused on the effective ways of using transportation source fees to help fund our transportation crisis. we think it's really the most efficient, but as we're going to get into, potentially the most fair way to look at this funding. And so as Chris mentioned, the 111 bus, we actually see it in data from the MBTA memo chair that those on buses stuck in the congestion created mostly by single occupancy vehicles are disproportionately lower income and people of color. And so already we just have a status quo that is unfair. Interestingly, every time we talk about pricing things, rebalancing the pricing of how we use road space, we get well, is that going to be fair for the person who has to drive to their job? Is that going to be fair for the person who has to drive to that hotel in Newton because there is no other way? It turns out, this is recent data that was actually done out of MIT.
Harvard Kennedy School.
Out of the Kennedy School, Harvard Kennedy School, excuse me, that showed only 1 out of 50 people driving around into Metro Boston are from households of below median income. So yes, there's potential that we're going to impact some people of lower means, but it's not the norm. And there are ways, again, I think Chris went through my slide from earlier, which is to structure some of these programs so that we can offset some of those impacts. Again, some of the things that our organization is really focused on for this is tax credits that help on the back ends for lower and middle income families, and especially important, equalizing and offsetting fares on our transit. So commuter rail, rationalizing those fares so it's more affordable, and decreasing fares on transit overall. This is another issue. You know, we talk about congestion as the inconvenience and the waste of time and money, but congestion also causes higher rates of pollution. And the communities that are impacted by where the congestion is mostly happening, if you think of where I-93 gets backed up to the north, you're talking East Somerville, Everett, Chelsea. A lot of those areas are also disproportionately low income and person of color neighborhoods, and they're being more heavily impacted by the particulate matter in the air from cars just idling in congestion. So this is important not just in a time, but it's also important in a public health area. So again, we think that structural protection, how we set up these programs, will be really important to ensuring that we reach the goals, which are reducing congestion, the behavior change necessary to reach all the climate change goals of the Commonwealth, and the revenue necessary to invest in the other options. So again, as I mentioned, tax credits for low and middle income people that do not take away the pricing impact. So my background, a little more of my background is I'm an economist, and so we think prices can really impact how people make all their choices, obviously. What we don't want to lose when we rebalance the pricing of our system and we rebalance the pricing of our roads is that decision that we all have to make on how we use it. And if we do rebates at the front end of that, we start to lose some of that decision. So we would suggest that it's better to take some of that revenue that we're going to gain from these programs and create a tax credit program for lower and middle income people to help offset some of that. We also think it's really important that some of this go into regional equity and that we better fund the Chapter 90, the municipal roads, and the regional transit authorities that have been pretty poorly underfunded for the last decade. The reality is, and this is from our current Secretary of Transportation, and to Chris's point, that if we are going to reduce congestion, if we are going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we must move more people in fewer vehicles. That's the reality. So if we don't want to do that in ways that make that decision efficient and raise some revenue to invest in our infrastructure, we are going to find other ways to do it. We are going to have to find other ways to do it. And again, as Chris mentioned with the 111, this is the same amount of people in cars as in one bus. And while we know that buses can't drive everywhere at all times, as you can see in our main arteries, there is a lot of space we're wasting in inefficient ways. And so we just need to have a more modern way of thinking of how we price and fund the system. I think this is where we open it up for Q&A, although I prefer this picture. So. Now that we're moving on to Q&A now, and you can ask me all the questions that I didn't get to see in the slide.